Stella has a special role within the fashion industry, I think. The company was founded in 2001. It was founded as a vegetarian luxury brand. We are the only, as far as I know, vegetarian luxury brand in the world, meaning that we don't use any leather, any fur, any skins. In that way, sustainability and innovation has always been a core part of the business. I'm sure that you've heard a lot about this today already. You know, we're in an interesting situation, maybe not interesting, a slightly terrifying situation right now in the world when it comes to our impact. You know, every day there's a day, Earth Overshoot Day. That day will be very soon. It will be July 29th of this year. So on that day, every year, we have used up the resources that the planet can naturally regenerate. That day typically moves up every year. So we're getting very near to this. So right now we're using about 1.7 times what the Earth can naturally regenerate in a year. So as of July 29th, we will have had all the fresh air that can naturally be regenerated. We will have cut down all of the trees that can naturally regenerate. And we're doing that every year, and the day's moving up closer to the beginning of the year. That may or may not make sense to you in how it relates to the fashion industry, but the fashion industry is an incredibly resource-intensive industry. I think some people think of fashion as a very far away, distant thing, you know, catwalks, ball gowns, but I mean, fashion is just clothing. And we all wear clothing. It's one of the things that we genuinely absolutely interact with on a day-to-day basis. We get dressed. What we're wearing has a footprint. It typically has a very oversized footprint for what it represents, which is just the ability to cover our bodies. Continuing on this trajectory that we're on right now, using this amount of resources, the UN tells us that we only have about 60 years of soil left to grow things. We're growing things for the fashion industry. Obviously, maybe we don't want to be using the soil for that. We may want to use it for food. The UN tells us that we have lost 60% of the wildlife on the planet since 1970, that 50% of our coral reefs have died. And so this is, I mean, it does feel quite dire. And I do think that, you know, it's important to set that tone, set that context. I'm sure everyone here knows that. But it does relate, again, directly back to the fashion industry. The fashion industry is one of the most polluting industries in the world. It was often cited as the second most polluting. That was debunked by the New York Times last year. I mean, of course, you can't rate industries 1, 2, 3 most polluting. What we do know is the fashion industry has, again, a very oversized footprint. It is very polluting. The fashion industry, just the dyeing for the fashion industry, so the color that we're all wearing, represents around 20% of all industrial water pollution globally. And that's just the dyeing piece. We're not talking about agriculture. We're not talking about anything else that the fashion industry touches up against. It is massive. And the other major issue that we're facing in the industry right now is just the amount of waste that we're creating. In the past, you know, clothing was a bit more expensive. We invested a bit more in what we purchased, but now we can buy things at a very low price. It gives us access to things in an interesting way, but through that transition of clothing becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, our interaction with clothing has changed. You know, we don't treat clothing as something that needs to be valued. We often treat it as a disposable product. And that is generating a truly alarming amount of waste. The statistic from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is that one dump truck of clothing is burned or landfilled every second. That 90% of all clothing ends up landfilled or burned, and only 1% of textiles globally are recycled back into textiles. So we are dealing with mountains of waste. In this country, you know, it's something that's definitely been in the news. I was part of a parliamentary hearing last year around this. The Parliament did take this seriously. There was a recommendation made through a report that a 1-cent tax get added to all purchases to deal with the amount of waste being generated. Unfortunately, that did not go through. But it is an issue. You know, in the past, we kind of exported our waste into other countries, but people don't want our waste anymore. The rise of fast fashion, the rise of disposable fashion it's kind of burying us with waste. And right now, the size of this industry, if it continues in this way, it will use up 1/4 of the carbon budget for the entire planet, over 1/4, by 2050. So just to give, it's a little bit doom and gloom, but I do think it's an important context when we're thinking about sustainability and how innovation kind of fits into the future that we need to see to create an industry for fashion for us as humans who want to wear clothing that doesn't create this type of negative impact. So for us at Stella, we always talk about redefining luxury. So we're a luxury brand. You know, we're a high-priced company. I'm sure that, you know, most people don't interact with the luxury sector. I didn't before I worked there. But in in the luxury space, we really do believe that, at our price point, in our positioning, that we need to show that you can create clothing, you can create design, you can create beautiful products that don't have to cost the planet, people, or animals. And so we are always looking for ways to disrupt things, to rethink things, to really try and create a different way for the fashion industry to exist. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about where we're thinking, where we're focusing, what we are looking at. So for us, when we're talking about sustainability at Stella, we're mostly talking about raw materials. So when we look at our overall environmental footprint as a company, around 50 to 60%, depending on the year, closer to 60 typically, of our entire company footprint is in the raw material stage. So that's the field, the farm, the forest. It's the very furthest part of our supply chain. It's the part that's the hardest to get to in a lot of ways because it takes a lot of steps to turn a plant into a t-shirt, to turn a cotton plant into a t-shirt. But because the impact is so large in that stage, it is where we're looking at. It's what we're thinking about. This is, of course, just our footprint, but it does represent most of the industry. It's a little bit different for some of the sports brands. If you're a company that's using a lot of synthetics and not as many natural materials, sometimes your footprint gets a bit more in your processing dyeing phase, and a little bit less in your raw materials phase. But overall, in the industry, the biggest impact that we have as an industry is in our raw materials. And so for us, that's what we're thinking about. We're thinking about how can we disrupt those systems, how can we create systems that are better, and within the innovation, biotech, circularity space, we're thinking about how can we disrupt the materials that exist now. One thing that Stella always talks about that I think is very relevant when we're thinking about the types of materials that we use in the industry is that we've really been using the same basic materials for very many years. In the industry, we rely on cotton. Polyester is the most used material, and then cotton, and then viscose, rayon, which I'll talk about in a minute. We use polyester, nylon, rayon, like I said. Those are materials that were created in the 1950s, 1930s. We haven't had a new material, a new building block for the industry in a very long time. We still use things that, were used in the Stone Age. We're still using hemp, we're still using linen, we're still using wool. So I think that what's really interesting with the biotech space and what we're interested in is creating new materials, or the possibility of creating new materials that can disrupt what we're using now and hopefully have a much lower footprint.